There are two basic motivating forces, fear and love. When we're afraid, we pull back from life. When we're in love, we open up to all that life has to offer with passion, excitement, and acceptance.
Coming to you from our studio in Santa Barbara, California, this is the Fear Me Out podcast. We're not your typical self-help program. Our show takes a deep dive into those psychological issues that affect us on a daily basis. We hope to shift your perspective and have you experiencing emotions differently. Now here are your hosts, Kim Foskey and Dr. Dana Saperstein.
Welcome back, folks. Today we'll begin a discussion regarding the fear of money. They say it's the root of all evil, but is it? Today we'll be joined in studio by Chris Young, artisan, businessman, and surfer, whose upper-class upbringing didn't necessarily set him up for success or lay a solid foundation as it relates to his perception of money. This is a very candid and insightful conversation, and we hope you enjoy it.
Really
so
appreciate
there's some commonality in the room here today, and it's not just because there's three guys sitting here. We actually all have the fear of money, and welcoming into our podcast studio on this beautiful Sunday afternoon is all the way from La Costa, California, is Chris Young. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you.
To the Fear Me Out podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you agreed to come today?
Sure. Well, I agreed to be here today because I want to contribute, and I may be representative of a lot of people out there, I suspect, but anything I can do to help is why I want to be here. So a little background on myself. Let's see. I'm 68. I'm a retired goldsmith and diamond setter. I grew up in Southern California in the San Fernando Valley. I would describe my upbringing as uneventful. Certainly, I didn't experience any real trauma in my youth. I came from a fairly upper middle class environment, and I'm very, very fortunate. So, that's a general start there.
So again, the topic that we're talking about today is actually the fear of money, and can you tell us a little bit about? You talked about having a middle class or upper middle class affluent upbringing, and maybe what your thoughts were about money as growing up.
So both my parents, my father in particular, was raised in utter poverty, and he actually lived in and out of multiple orphanage type environments in New York. So and he was a successful writer for television. So he was a very successful self-made individual. But money was very, very important to him. I would not consider myself spoiled. I didn't have things handed to me. I think my parents tried I think they were very diligent in trying to teach me the importance of money, but I'm not so sure it always worked. One of the thoughts I just had was, like any kid, I got an allowance, and I had to do chores around the house, but my allowance was way more than anybody else's back in the day. This is, back in the 60s, right? And I probably was 12 years old at the time. But I was given $2 a week, and I had to take the trash out and things like that. But if I failed to bring the trash cans in on time, or I hit my little sister, or left clothes on the floor, it was a quarter off. A quarter off for this, a quarter off for that. And the bottom line was I never got my $2.
So your dad implied or invoked the punitive damages if you didn't fully commit to the whole $2 piece.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to this day, I still question whether or not it was about education or just his being cheap.
Did you ever owe him money at the end of a week?
God, I hadn't thought about that, but something in the back of my head is telling me that situation probably existed for some reason that I don't recall. But
did your mom share a similar philosophy in terms of money and money values?
I'll be blunt. I think my poor mother was beaten into submission by an overly dominant partner in my dad. She was a sweetheart of a woman. She was intelligent, accomplished. She had a previous professional career prior to having kids, and she went extremely passive as a mother and a parent. So I wouldn't, and having said that, she was the more involved one. Both my parents were in an investment club back in those days that invested in stocks, and she took the lead role in that. Not that there was a whole lot of education from them regarding that in my upbringing, but both my parents were active in the stock market the whole time I grew up.
And that may be fairly common. I'm not going to speak for Dana. I'll speak for myself here, but that may be fairly common with that generation because, as we were talking earlier, my dad was a fairly successful business person, but my mom ran the books at home. So any of the financial decisions that were made at home, my mom actually made those decisions. So she was actively involved in the finances outside of his own business that way. And I had the same thing. I had a mother that I loved and so on and so forth, and a dad that was overly domineering. Very similar, that just kind of stood by and just let what happened happen there.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly my experience, and Dana and I have talked at length in the past about having a father who is narcissistic, and I certainly can see that now. I didn't recognize that growing up. I pretty much idolized my father as someone who was cool and accepted, living, he was working with celebrities and whatnot in Hollywood. So it was I admired him. And, well, I guess that's all I've got on that for now.
So you grew up pretty much in the entertainment industry.
Yes.
So there is a lot of coattails to follow in that. If he's had successful actor friends, successful director or writer friends in there, there's a lifestyle and a persona that you want to keep up there. Did that happen in your family?
So I was not pushed in any way growing up as a kid in terms of school. I was never forced to do my homework. It wasn't checked. I wasn't locked down in my room, et cetera, et cetera. I was basically it was also part of the time. This is the 60s and early 70s. And I was to become bloom into the flower that I had been meant to be, whatever the hell that was supposed to mean. And so I wasn't pushed into any professional direction or even a college career for that matter. Again, I honestly, in retrospect, I think it was probably part of a financial decision on my parents' part also. But anyway, you raise a very good point, because while we're going to talk about the fear of money and fear of losing money in particular, I think everybody has that fear to a degree. I think everybody, I'm generalizing, of course. I don't think it's uncommon for people to experience various levels of anxiety. While I struggled with fear of not making enough money or being more successful at different periods in my life, two things occurred. I always correlated my self-worth as a person to how successful I was financially. So I knew I was good at my career as a jeweler, as a goldsmith and diamond setter. I was in demand and I won awards and had a lot of success doing it. It wasn't a super lucrative business, but we certainly lived comfortably enough. We lived in a nice house. I raised a family successfully. My wife worked full time the whole time we were raising kids, also as self-employed. But I know that as I was trying to increase my income as a jeweler, I got into other branches of the jewelry business. I tried buying and selling antique jewelry and things like that in an attempt to earn more money because I didn't feel I was very successful financially. And to me, that was a complete reflection of I looked at it as a failure.
So do you know where that thought process came from? Because you had mentioned earlier that your parents are pretty supportive of you going out and doing whatever you wanted per se in terms of a career and profession and things like that. So do you understand where kind of I have to make this money to see myself as being successful or more self-worth? Do you have an idea where that may have come from in that area?
Let's backtrack just a second to what you said. I don't think I was supported in terms of blossoming into what I naturally should be. I think there just wasn't any interest in pushing me into anything because it was too much work.
Okay.
There's a big difference. And to your second point there, do I know where it came from? No, other than the fact that when I was 27, I had a panic attack. And it wasn't severe, but I had I was short of breath. I had heart palpitations. And I was, of all places, surfing with just a couple of people at a beautiful spot in San Diego. And why I was having this physical reaction and I just didn't want to be around anybody. I had no idea what a panic attack was. I sought help immediately, and I discovered that I basically was dealing with anxiety, which I knew nothing about at that time. So where did that fear come from? Well, I basically learned that I have a underlying anxiety trait.
Hey, Chris, your dad obviously wasn't hugely involved in your education and the choice of a career that you made. Was he accepting of the choice you made? How did he feel about you being a jeweler? Did that meet his expectations?
No, he was never critical until after the fact.
Well, I'm not sure if it's exactly what you mean.
Was he accepting of me being a jeweler? No, because it was he was looking for, I think he was hoping his son would take a more traditional, predictable career path than a craftsman-oriented, uncertain, what is somebody with the skill set of designing and working in precious metals, where do they go? They have a retail store or what? Or they get into manufacturing. I don't think he knew anything about any of that. And I think he was more hopeful that I had a more traditional career path. And I will say that he told me when I was 42 years old as a jeweler, he said to me, you're going to be 50 in a few years. It's now or never. You better do something. And he's telling me that at 42. So I pretty much had a ringing endorsement of his non-acceptance.
And so how did you handle knowing that your father didn't approve of your level of success or even the choice of your career?
Well, that was easy. I anesthetized myself with alcohol. I mean, that was one thing I did. But actually, throughout those years, I was sober. On that note, real quickly, I started, I don't know if this is part of it, but I probably started drinking at age 20, and by age 31, I realized I was an alcoholic, and I went to an outpatient treatment to stop drinking at that point. And I had a kid, and I didn't want to be a drunk dad. So I got sober and stayed sober until my kids were in college.
Do you remember at 20 why you started drinking? I mean, that's, obviously for all of us that were 20 at one point, that's pretty common, right? But,
yeah, except that, people would bring a 6-pack of Coors Light to a party, and I would bring a 6-pack of tall malt liquors. And I always wanted to do more. Drinking for me started out as a recreational, fun, social activity, and I just wanted more. And as life stresses increased with early career decisions and marriage and children, the drinking changed from a fun social thing to a stress reliever. And I simply overindulged. I have a very high bottom, quite frankly, but it was between the anxiety and the fear, which is really what we're addressing. It was I refer to it as an anesthetic.
And there were no substance abuse issues with either your mother or father or anybody else in your family?
Let's see. I had a grandfather who died at age 52 from alcohol. And my parents both were social drinkers, but extremely disciplined. So they were never, I wouldn't describe them as alcoholics.
Did they use other substances in order to deal with their anxiety?
My mother didn't. My father went through a whole slew of prescribed pharmaceuticals, but he did it in a very disciplined fashion. But, when you wake up in the morning and you're talking to your dad and his words are slurring, he's still
under the influence. You had mentioned in your introduction that you have a younger sister.
Yes.
Any commonality with her in terms of how she was raised? Obviously, you were the oldest, and the oldest the parents do all their trial and error on you, and the youngest one seems to get away with more things. But did she grow up similarly as you? Did she come up out with the same values, the same fears?
Yes.
Okay.
And we're both, she unfortunately even more so than I, are very fearful of loss, of something being taken away from us. I can't speak for her in terms of her sense of self-worth in relation to money, but she's extremely OCD. And I don't use that term loosely. I won't elaborate, but she's genuinely OCD. She's quite reclusive, and she needed the approval more than I from my father, and she didn't get it either. So she's a pretty she's a functioning shattered individual at this point.
We all have parents that kind of grew up, were younger during the Depression era and stuff like that. You said, and my parents also grew up without money as well. Was that a conversation growing up about? Did they talk to you about their upbringing, and how tough they had it, and so on and so forth?
My mother would never complain. She wasn't a complainer. And both my parents were single children, and my father would discuss it, but it wasn't something I wouldn't describe them if this is where you're going. I wouldn't describe them as playing the victim role. You know, I tip my hat to my dad for his ability to pull him up from the bottom of the barrel into the successful professional individual that he became. But so there was discussion of money, but we were never struggling financially.
The reason I ask about that is, like I said, my parents, including my father, kind of grew up in the same thing, became self-made, successful, and so on and so forth. Ended up taking care of his parents. And in looking back on it, in terms of how he dealt with his parents, my mother, his siblings, I have an older sister as well, that success and that money gave him the power over everybody else. So it was like a king. To me, it was like a king sitting on his throne, talking to his subjects. And that's how I was brought up in that way.
Your situation is identical to mine, to the point that it nauseated me, because my mother would wait on him. And I mean, it's, you know, you and I we have quite a bit in common. It's interesting.
Yeah, and why I'm saying this is because because I saw that, and the same thing, had that visceral reaction as you did in dealing with it, and more so as I got older. Money became less important to me, in a way, right? It was not. I was trying not to let it define me, but it was the same thing that you were talking about earlier. Was the way I was brought up was, well, what kind of career are you going to have? What kind of life are you going to have? What kind of life are you going to provide for your wife and your children, and so on and so forth? And what kind of standing you're going to have in your community? So you better make a good living, and because that's how you're going to be looked at in life. And I spent years trying to fight that. I spent years chasing the money, and always found it when I was chasing it, but still had that visceral reaction every time about that.
You said at the beginning of that just a minute ago that, say it again, you lost interest in chasing money? Or eventually, because I had this parental voice in my head, which I still have it in my fifth decade here. I still have that voice in my head that, that money defines you. And that's where, people are going to respect you from. That's where people are going to know you from, so on and so forth. And that buys you a better life. And I spent my better part of 4 decades trying to understand that and fighting against that, until I finally realized, like I was saying, chasing the money was always there in my career. If I needed to make more money, I went out and made more money. More money didn't get rid of that feeling. It bought me a lot more things, including a really nice house and cars and things like that. But I still had this feeling, this uneasy feeling that never went away. And I always thought it was money. If I made more money, then that feeling would go away, because money provided security. Money didn't provide security, because when money went away, the feeling didn't go away. Or if I made more money, the feeling didn't go away. I don't share that experience. I have forever been chasing the money. Because again, I wouldn't describe the income that Barbara and I have made over the years as anything. It isn't elaborate. It's certainly been sufficient to live in Southern California comfortably, but we were always paycheck to paycheck, and so I still am very concerned about. Not only am I concerned about making money, I'm concerned about and I'm very fearful of I inherited money when both my parents passed away 15 years ago. And it would be horrific for me to see that what I inherited got not just, I would never, pardon the language, but piss it away. But if I blew it by stupid investments, I would feel even less than, I don't know. I don't feel bad that I have inherited money at all. I don't look at it as entitlement or anything, but I'm glad I've got it because it's taken some of the pressure off of me. But the need to manage it successfully is a top priority for me. And through the ups and downs of the markets and the world we live in, I've, along with an addictive nature, I've had some significant wins on various investments, and I've had some traumatic losses. And I've never lost a house, but I will say that I had a combination of events hit me at the beginning of 2020, pre-COVID, that it was a combination. It was a perfect storm of events that I began to wonder if I was going to have to sell my house. And that to me is, I can't tell you how much shame, embarrassment. You talk about a bottoming out of self-esteem. I'm my own. I beat myself up a lot, and I'm my own worst enemy. And I've been described as the most insecure person somebody's ever met. I've been told that. How did you handle that despair and fear and shame in that recently?
Yeah. What happened?
I'll just refer to 2020 as the COVID year.
Yeah.
And the reality is that it was a blessing for me because I had been drinking for a few years prior to that. And it was getting worse and worse at the end of 2019. But I figured I'd just manage it. I was a high functioning individual like that. And so COVID was a blessing. When March of 20 rolled around and the markets were doing what they were doing, it pretty much threw me over the edge to the point where by May I was getting back involved in a program and things. So the short answer is I drank more and more, but I had been drinking more previously. And because of my fear of loss of my whole family, I wouldn't have. I would have been invisible to all my extended family members. I would have been part of holidays and whatnot, but the thought of doing that with everything else, I knew I had to make some changes. So I drank more to solve the problem initially, and it forced me into sobriety.
Okay. And how did it affect the way you felt about yourself as a person?
I thought I had proven to myself that I was a loser.
Oh, okay.
See, you didn't know you thought you knew it all. The older you get, Chris, you've got wisdom to rely on. You're not going to make those mistakes again. Blah blah blah, and well, you just blew it. You just lost. 2/3 of what you had, and are in jeopardy of. You don't know how you're going to continue to support your current lifestyle.
Part of what Kim and I have come to understand is that when we have a really strong negative voice inside of us, it's often comes from someone else that sort of instilled that in us in the process of us becoming, human beings. Kim talks about, being really poorly treated by his father and then internalizing that pain and that view of himself. And although I wasn't overtly abused by my father, I was pretty much neglected by him. and grew up sort of feeling like I didn't have much value. And that left me wondering what I could bring to the table, what people would care about, what people would love about me. So is this like your father's voice inside of you that's masquerading as Chris?
Not only is it a voice inside of me, when they passed away, there were file cabinets full of all kinds of documents and business things, but there were also letters that my father had written, many of which he had sent to me, but some of which he didn't. And I found some of those unsent letters, and they were not to me. They were just sort of diary types of documents. And they specifically talked about, it was my father describing how disappointed he was in me. So he never said it to me, but I found that. And I found that, 15 years ago, 14 years ago,
After he died?
After he died.
That's your father's legacy that he left you, is all that information about how he disrespected you and
Yeah, it hurts. But one of the things, go ahead.
No, I was gonna ask you what your reaction to it was, because similar but not is my father verbalized how disappointed he was in me, not only growing up and through teenage years, but I was trying to figure out how old I was when he passed, but I was well into my third, probably almost my fourth decade at that point. And he told me to the day he died that I wasn't going to amount to anything.
I was basically...
And he verbalized it. I didn't have to find it in a letter, fortunately.
Well, I was told that, but it wasn't through direct sentences to me, but it was through, hey, Dad, I just won an award for best design at this conference, jewelry conference. Not even that. Oh. There was never any compliments. There was never any, I mean, I don't want to get off track too much, but I was never told ever that he loved me. He never told me he was proud of me. I mean, all that stuff. And
right.
I just accepted it. Quite honestly, I'm not a victim here. Dana will tell you, I don't feel like a victim. But I did learn something, and my wife brought this up to me. There were events. For instance, he did help us get into our first house with a family loan. And the end of that whole story is I ended up having to pay that loan back once we had made money on the house and we're moving to another one. And I was furious with him because he showed me that he was putting money as a more important element in our relationship than me.
Right.
And I knew that, but when I had a series of events like that take place, it was cemented in me. And I'd be furious, but I had learned to not stay mad very long because I didn't want to hate my dad. I could have walked away from my family. I didn't want to do that. I still wanted a family. And my wife never understood why I still continued to have any kind of relationship with him. I just learned to get over the crap that happened to me, and I would move on.
So you never saw your inheritance as something that was either owed to you or you were indifferent in terms of...
No, I never thought it was owed to me. I hoped I would get it. And both my wife and I describe ourselves professionally as bootstrap kinds of people. We're both self-employed, always have been. So I don't expect anything.
When I inherited money, I guess when my mom just passed away this last year, I had this feeling that money was dirty. Only because of how I was raised and how it always came with conditions. Even though she had passed on, I still felt it came with conditions. And I write in the book here, and I'm giving away a piece of the book here, that this differentiation, if Pablo Escobar would have given me money versus my parents, I would have felt better taking it from him than inheriting it from my parents.
Boy, quite honestly, I don't understand that view. I don't share that view.
It was, and I understand that. I mean, that's just my individual, of how the conditions and how much it played in my life and how much stress it put on me and so on and so forth. And the same thing, they paid for college for me. That did come with conditions as well. They did help me buy my first place as well. That came with conditions as well. It wasn't like you said, when you had to pay the whole thing back and so on and so forth. It wasn't about, I'm going to do this out of the goodness of my heart, get you started, hope it works out, you handle it from here. It was almost like we want to set you up for failure, almost. Like, okay, we're going to do this because we feel we're obligated, because we're your parents to do this, but we know you can't handle it. And when you can't handle it, we're going to surely let you know you messed up here. And so that was, even my dad had passed 15, 16 years before my mother had, and she had kind of softened up over the years before Alzheimer's kicked in and so on and so forth. But I still got a little bit of that feeling from her, and again, growing up from a Depression era type thing, they never thought they were going to have enough money to live out their lives. Even though I kept telling my mother, I said, you could come back and live a very comfortable whole nother life with the money that you have. And again, they were very good about how they managed their money. There wasn't anything to have to unwind or uncover. My mom was like a CPA in terms of how she kept her bookkeeping and legally and everything. So if I'm going to give them credit for anything, I'll give them credit for that. They kept their side of their money and the bookkeeping and everything clean. So my sister and I didn't have to deal with that portion of it. But, as I sit here having this discussion with the both of you today, I have this fear that I'm going to run out of money. Still, I can just sit there and still think, 20, 30, 40 years ago, that voice in my head that my dad kept instilling in me that you were not going to be able to handle it. You're going to screw it up. You're going to, just like you said, you're going to piss it away or whatever. I still have that voice in my head saying, geez, maybe I will.
Part of that, I think, this is my theory, changes due to age and mortality awareness. And everybody has a fear of not having enough. I could cite you other examples of people I know with significantly more, and they have the same fears. So I think there's a universal quality to that. Obviously, there's other influences. We've talked about anxiety and individual scenarios. But as I've gotten older, part of the reason I don't think I'm quite as fearful now is because, I don't know if we should be talking about the fact that I've addressed my anxiety issues by taking a pharmaceutical that's I've benefited from, and it's eased my anxieties. That's obviously a factor and a significant one. But I'm 68, and while I'm in good shape and I will physically probably live a long time, I have no idea what will happen mentally.
So, Chris, you talked about, as you got older, about your mortality and how that changed your perspective on money. I'm kind of interested on how your perspective changed based on that.
So in terms of fear of losing money or fear of the potential loss of money, in the past, it was ever present. It was partly a reflection of my self-worth and what it would indicate if I lost that money. It was partly a fear of losing a lifestyle that was by no stretch exorbitant, but I didn't, nobody wants to have their lifestyle change dramatically for go lower. And as I've gotten older, and we all hear about mortality awareness, but I don't know if, I think people need to experience elements in life through time to really begin to understand what that means. And while I'm in good shape, things are beginning physically to slow down. And I realize, at 68, I've got X number of years to do whatever those things with money that I could do. I've got a pretty finite amount of time to potentially use that money, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of things like losing a house, I mean, that's really kind of unrealistic, and because one of the benefits, quite frankly, of living in Southern California is appreciating home prices. So how starving am I really going to be in the event that I'm not successfully managing what I have? So the awareness of my time being limited has eased the concern. I'm not looking at some indefinite period of, I'm going to need X amount of money for the next 30 years. Well, 30 years from now, if I'm alive, I'll be lucky if I'm walking in a park with my great grandchildren, and that's not going to cost a lot. That's not a financial threat. Along with the bit of wisdom that comes with things like mortality awareness, and Dana and I were talking about this, and he'll probably elaborate on much, much more clearly than I am. But side note here, I'm not a self-promoter. I don't brag about my accomplishments and tell people how great I am. I shy away from that. I don't take credit for things real comfortably either. And I say that because, quite honestly, Dana has pointed out to me that through the financial ups and downs that we all go through over the course of 10 or 20 years, I've had some big losses, but I've battled back. I never knew how I was going to do it, but somehow I managed to do that. And when one does that, like any experience, repeatedly, you begin to have a little bit more faith in yourself, in your ability to do these things. So part of the wisdom I've gained through my experiences are, okay, if there is a downturn coming, I've been through this before, and I'll figure out a way to manage it because I have in the past.
So, intuition for you, does it play? You talked about faith and having a lot of life experience, not only in with money and work and so on and so forth. And you've been down and you've come back. So you've been able to parlay that experience into kind of like, okay, everything's going to be okay, no matter what. But how about your actual intuition and trusting yourself? I mean, do you go from the intuition point of view as well?
That's a good question, because I think in the past I would have doubted myself much more. And because I suppose for all the family history topics we've covered previously, I don't think I doubt myself nearly as much anymore. For a variety of reasons. Again, I suppose age and experience. I'm more confident in my abilities to navigate things going forward. And I do want to add that this isn't just some overnight change. It's been a process of things. It's been through various therapies that I'm currently involved in and have been involved in for years. It's also through pharmacological treatments that have benefited me, which I've never been a part of in the past. Simple brain chemistry adjustments that have helped alleviate my anxiety, which has helped me not repeatedly dwell on the negative things when they occur. I don't know about everybody else, but if in the past, if I would get up and break a shoelace, I'd be annoyed and say, and I wouldn't really think it too much, but I'd think, all right, well, and if I go downstairs and go to look for my keys and I can't find them, oh boy, well, that's strike two. And if I go out to my car and I've got a flat tire, holy crap, I knew it. Today's shot, today's ruined. I don't think like that anymore through a combination of everything I just described in terms of therapies. So.
Dean, I feel that Chris and I have kind of commandeered this whole discussion here. And like I said in our intro, when I was introducing everybody and talking about the three of us having a commonality besides being all men, that you have a somewhat similar experience. It seems like Chris and I are kind of on a little bit more on the same page, but you have a similar experience about how you were raised with money. And I don't think we've talked to you much about how you were raised and what you've had to overcome in terms of what your father taught you or didn't teach you.
Well, it is interesting. I've been listening to both of you and realizing that I grew up in a very different culture when it comes to do with money. I grew up in the Jewish culture, and what I was indoctrinated with from the beginning is that if you don't crave money and look at money as an asset and go after it with all the effort that you can put, then there's something actually wrong with you. So it's really the complete opposite of, in a way, of what you guys were raised with. My dad came from an incredibly poor background. He had to quit high school when he was 14 to support his family, which included his mother and father and two brothers. To this day, have no idea how he did that, but he managed. He figured out a way to make sure that there was enough food for everybody and shelter. And when we came to the United States, when I was about 4 or 5, he started to become actually quite successful. And he always told me over and over again that money was almost like magic in his mind. That if you had money, then you didn't need to worry about anything. And I understood that from his perspective because he didn't have any. And he would go to sleep a lot of times, without a roof over his head and without food in his belly. But he made sure that my family, his family, my brother and my sister and I and my mom, I can't ever remember going to sleep without food or without shelter. He just absolutely did everything in his power to make sure that we never suffered the kind of poverty and deprivation that he suffered. And he always told me that I could be as successful and have as much money as I ever wanted. He never diminished my intelligence or my capacity or my ability in any way. He was always super encouraging. He believed that school was the answer to success. And he told me from the beginning that any school I ever wanted to go to, he would pay for happily. And that he had the expectation that I become a professional person. He was really kind in leaving it up to me to decide what kind of profession I wanted to embrace. But he just had the expectation that, and that I had the ability, and he supported it fully. The biggest problem that I noticed in his life was that he had a lot of anxiety himself. He had a real serious problem with food, and he really believed that if he just had enough money, everything would be fine. Back in those days, if you had $1 million, you would be super wealthy. So he always said, once I have my $1 million, you guys will see, everything will be perfect. And I used to sort of look at him like, well, what does that have to do with enjoying life? But in his mind, it was magic, and he encouraged me to pursue that magic. So it's a really different experience than what you guys describe in this way. Along with the cultural aspect of it, he just made sure that I knew that I had what it took. And I appreciated how much confidence he had in me in those ways. Now, I would say emotionally he was very distant and disconnected because all he did was spend his time making money. And every time he became really successful, he would destroy it within a very short period of time. So as a little kid, we would go from rags to riches over and over again, probably 4 or 5 times in the course of my childhood, because he didn't feel that he deserved whatever it is that he was able to create. Now, I don't think he understood that, but it certainly operated in a very dramatic way, because I would watch him become really successful and we'd have tons of money. And then within a really short period of time, sometimes weeks, we were living somewhere else. One time we went from a 2-acre, 5-bedroom, beautiful house to an apartment building that was really awful and uncomfortable. And he didn't really understand how self-destructive he was in the name of money. And then by the time I became a teenager, he actually started doing therapy himself. And he became to understand that that he was destroying what he was creating. And I don't think he really understood that. And once he understood it, he became fabulously wealthy and spent the rest of his life making a lot of money and living a really sort of grand life. I don't know if it ever made him happy, because he certainly didn't seem to enjoy life a whole lot more than when he was struggling, but he achieved his goals, that's for sure. So my experience was very different in that regard. He just taught me that if I worked hard, that I could have whatever I wanted.
We attach emotion, we attach power, we attach a number of things to money.
Yep.
And money is really a neutral emotion, or doesn't carry an emotion, correct?
Well, I think it's the fear, like we've talked about before, is how you manage the fear. Most people manage the fear by being very aggressive, as we've talked about before, either by taking it out on the world or taking it out on themselves. Chris, part of what you described is that that fear of losing money or somehow it disappearing from your life. You took that and turned it into a statement of your value as a person, becoming very self-critical. That's a sad way, as you, Kim and I have talked about, to manage fear, because it's turning it into aggression and taking that aggression out on yourself. Now you're describing that as you're aging, you have more faith, based on the fact that, yes, you have lost money at times, but I don't know if you've noticed this consciously, but you've always come back from the losses. You've never given up. And so I'm assuming that there's faith that has developed inside of you. Maybe you're not aware of it, but you're certainly, the less fear you have, the more faith you have in its place. So some of that may be due to the aging process, but I wouldn't take for granted the fact that I've known you for a very long time, and I have known you through the times that you have been really scared and felt, that a loss acutely. And then the next thing I know, I speak to you a month or two later, and you're back to where you started. And I think, wow, this guy is really good at finding his way back and not allowing the what you could perceive as failure to stop you from moving forward. And I think that resilience, the more that you pay attention to it, and it doesn't have to make your ego gigantic, because we're not, we're talking about your ability, not necessarily who you are, although those things are related. But to feel confident in your ability is what will give you the faith to be able to move forward when you have a setback in your life. So I think that's important to acknowledge. Again, Kim, you and I are big on faith and big on how we manage fear and intuition. And a lot of times we don't even know that we're using our intuition. Some of the decisions I'm sure that you've made financially, they didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of maybe some reading and knowledge that you attained, but there's also a feeling underneath. And I'm not sure that you've paid as much attention to that feeling as you could, but you can't take a step forward unless you feel enough confidence, to pull the trigger on whatever it is that you're thinking about doing. And that's a feeling. And for whatever reason, you were able to get to a place where you can trust your feelings, no matter how bad you felt about the losses that you incurred. And that is really, truly that you're managing your fear by focusing on how it feels inside, knowing that you want to move forward and do the best you can to redeem the situation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So I think that you have also had the same experience when it comes to money. Is that not true? That you've had some ups and downs?
Definitely.
But
Peaks and valleys.
Yeah, but it seems to me like you've never given up either.
No, I haven't. And we were talking about earlier about chasing the money, right? When I felt that it was going to be money that was going to provide me the security and the confidence and the
Right.
lack of anxiety, I was out there chasing the money, and every time I chased it, I made the money, right? If I needed to make 30% or 40% more, I did. If I needed to go make even more than that, I always did. So I always had this confidence that if I needed to go make the money, I could. Right. But I still had that idea in my head that it wasn't about the money, right? Because I kept making more money and I wasn't changing the feeling inside.
Right.
At all. But I did have the intuition, like if I needed to do it and the faith as well, that I could go out and do it.
You know, you're bringing up a good point in that my idea about most of the topics that you and I talk about have to do with how you feel about yourself deep down inside. And that if you feel, not from an ego perspective, but just from an inherent perspective that you deserve the goodness that life has to offer, generally speaking, I think the world cooperates with that intention. Because I don't worry much about money at all and haven't for a very long period of time. I used to, but the more that I was able to sort of kind of surrender myself to my version of God and understand that I'm going to be taken care of in the process of taking care of other people, that I just stopped worrying about the money. And just whenever I felt like there was something that I needed, if I had an opening in my schedule or whatever, I would just sit down and talk to God and say, hey, you know what my requirements are? You know the kind of people I love to work with, and I'm counting on you to help in whatever way possible to help those people find me. And usually within a very short period of time, the phone rings, and the next thing I know, my schedule's full again. Now, I can't prove that what I'm saying is true. I can only say that based on my experience, it's helped me develop the kind of faith to know that I don't need to focus on that part of my life. What I want to focus on is being of service and doing the best I can to help people that find their way into my life. And the money sort of takes care of itself in a certain way in that process.
We have a few more minutes left, and I since the three of us are all parents here, and we were all raised, some of us similar, some of us dissimilar in terms of our value and our outlook on money. I'm kind of interested in you two's feedback on how you raised your children in terms of how to look at money or how to value themselves and so on and so forth. Or do they share any, do you know for a fact that they have similar fears in terms of money, or are they confident people that just go out, make their living, enjoy their life?
Personally, for me, I don't think my two sons, who are both in their mid-30s, share any of the anxiety that I had growing up. In fact, I know my one son is quite confident, but he's had his share of successes early in life. As far as teaching them money principles, they've been taught the basics, but the difference between what I have both taught them and exposed them to compared to what I was raised with are this, that I gave one example briefly of how when I was originally given money for a home, it was gifted to us, and then it was reclaimed when it was seen that a few years later we had equity in the second house we were buying, and that money was asked to be returned. That's one example of that I experienced where I saw money took priority over my relationship with my father in particular. I will never and have never let money be a priority over my relationship with my sons. I've given them plenty of money to both get into their first and second homes because I knew it was the only way I was able to do it, fortunately, but it was the only way they were going to be able to do that. I think that's the main thing for me. I've made sure that while money's important, I haven't prioritized it. Obviously, as a parent, you teach basic financial responsibilities to your children, but I haven't done anything exceptional beyond that as far as raising my kids.
Dana?
I think a lot about this sometimes because it's interesting. I have two kids, and they both look at money very differently, even though they were both raised with the same ideas about it. My son is really good at making money. He's become quite successful at a really early age, and he feels no hesitation in being successful and having as much money as he wants. There's no shame. There's no anything other than he's going to do everything he can to have the kind of life that he wants to have. My daughter, I think, is a little bit less confident in herself as far as money goes. She's successful in her own right, but I think I spoiled her a little bit, maybe even more than my son. So I think that she would like to live a life that she can't always afford. So I tease her a little bit sometimes about her healthy tastes and her and her spending habits. But I have raised both my kids to believe they deserve as much as they want, and that there's no shame in it, and that money buys freedom, and that's really the purpose of money. And as much freedom as you want, that's how much money you need to have. And there's no shame in it. And I think that, like you said, money is neutral. It's how you deal with it that determines whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I try to teach them to be as generous as they can. And I'm really lucky. My kids are very hardworking people, thanks to my wife. And I think they have a relatively healthy relationship to money.
All right, Dana. So as we end the podcast, like we end most of our podcasts, I think it's important after somebody that's listened to over an hour and heard these personal stories and maybe can relate to that or had gotten an epiphany from what one of us had said there. I think it's important to kind of summarize in what the important takeaway from this discussion is today.
Well, I would say a couple things, Kim. Number one is that I do know that oftentimes we're made to feel ashamed of our relationship to money, and that we're taught that if we want money, that makes us greedy, and that it speaks to our character to desire money. And I think that money is neutral, and it's how you deal with it that determines how it affects your life and how you live with it in relationship to other people. If you're generous and use your money not just for your own purposes, but if you have enough to take care of other people in some ways, then the money actually has a very positive effect in your life. The other thing, more than anything, is that I think that if you find yourself feeling really frightened about money, usually it has to do with how you feel about yourself deep down inside. And money, the fear of money, is a symptom of a deeper issue, and that issue usually has to do with whether you feel like you deserve a secure and comfortable life. And it's really sad how many people barely have enough money to survive in our country that is supposed to be a country of abundance. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of people that don't really feel very good about themselves, and that gets reflected in the way that they live financially. So I'd encourage you to understand that the fear might be normal, but it's really important to take a look at where that fear comes from and to get some help if you feel like you need to get to a place where you deserve the goodness that life has to offer.
Well, that was really good advice. This has been a very insightful conversation. Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming up here and sharing your personal story and your own insights. And we're very appreciative. I'm sure our listening audience will be very appreciative also. So
absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you both.
We appreciate our listeners and are interested in your comments and suggestions. feel free to email us at fearmeoutpodcast@gmail.com. If you are interested in becoming a sponsor for this podcast, please email us at fearmeoutpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.